in a theme which deals with participation and inequality. Okay, I thought I'd start with this quote from Hassan and Purser, which talks about the temporal dynamics of the network society. Just a kind of quote to get us thinking about boundaries and porosity. I just thought I would start with a photo from the 1970s, Moss Side in Manchester, Saturday afternoon in Manchester. So there's two women there getting ready for Saturday night out. My question might be, this is rather a simplistic question, but is, would those same women have the same opportunity of a Saturday night out these days? Most of us love the weekend, but where did it come from and where is it going? This presentation will look at a brief history of the weekend from the Manchester point of view, consider its significance and think about how the weekend is situated in the contemporary social world. I started off doing my research about the weekend, thinking about the history, where did it come from? And since Manchester's often called the shock city of the Industrial Revolution, the first industrial city, then it's, I think, quite appropriate that it actually may be one of the first cities in certainly the UK to have a Saturday afternoon free, in inverted commas, free from work. The new capitalists of the 19th century, as we've suggested, needed social time to be reorganised. In order to fully accumulate capital, they wanted guarantees about when their workers would be at work. So as Jean mentioned, the traditional feast and fair calendar, when days off would be taken at various points throughout the year, was regulated and legislated. The weekend was part of this new regulation. And rather than having Saturdays off, workers would take Mondays off as an informal holiday, which was, the day was called St. Monday. But that was regulated to, that's part of the reason perhaps why Saturday afternoons were made free time, so that the capitalists would know that it was a 5+2 or 5+1.5 weekend cycle. The birth of the weekend in Manchester dates from November 1843. As the city was one of the first industrial cities, it was one of the first to have the Saturday holiday. And employers agreed to close warehouses and factories at 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoons, known as the Saturday half holiday. If you look at newspapers during that time, there was a big debate about whether there should be a Saturday half holiday. The bourgeoisie, the newly moneyed bourgeoisie, were concerned that time off on a Saturday would mean either revolution or drunkenness. So they suggested that workers should engage in more morally improving types of recreation. This actually here, you can't see it very well, but this is the Saturday half holiday charter, which can be found in Manchester City Library, the employers, some of the employers in Manchester signed a charter to say that they would close at 2 p.m. every Saturday. It wasn't every employer to begin with, but latterly most employers adhered to it. So the weekend marked the delineation of the social world into times for work and times for play. Although these spaces were gendered and leisure spaces were unequally accessed, Saturday afternoon became the domain of leisure and of consumption. And I think those two things kind of go together. And if we look at nearly 20 years later, the Football Association was formed in 1863, and Newton Heath football team, the forerunner of Manchester United, was set up in 1878. And still in the UK, Saturday is a time to go shopping or go to the match. And we can see here a contemporary example of a kind of folk song entitled Victoria Bridge on a Saturday night. This is Manchester, it's Victoria Bridge, it's about markets that took place on a Saturday night. Again, this is Bellevue Amusement Park, frequented by Mancunians at the weekend. These kinds of leisure facilities were, I think, only possible because of the weekend time. The weekend time meant that leisure spaces were created. As I've said, there was a big moral and political anxiety about the leisure of the working classes. A big debate in the press regarding the Saturday half holiday. The end of the week was quickly to become more than just that. It began almost to have a life of its own, epitomised in its being known as the weekend. So that it wasn't just the week, the end of the week, it was the weekend with a kind of life of its own. Since then, it's become perhaps understood as a semi-autonomous time space, separate from the 5 preceding days. And one of the questions that I'm asking now is that changing? Is there a kind of de-differentiation between the week and the weekend? And does that matter, given the fact that that time and space was it was time spent collectively, but also it was free time from work, and I'm suggesting that that is not the case, and I'm asking whether that matters, and I would like to discuss that. The weekend seems to have become the kind of modern equivalent of sacred time. Some people might disagree with that. Certainly, in my research, I found that there was a kind of ritual element to the weekend, where people prepared on a Friday night for the Saturday and Sunday, and there was a kind of Sunday afternoon time when you re-entered the time of the week. Again, another photograph from the archives of Manchester Library, Saturday afternoon in the 1960s in Manchester. One of the points that Zerubbabel makes about the week and weekend is that it represents a kind of heterogeneity of days. There's a difference of days, allowing us to navigate our lives. Our social worlds are marked by qualitative heterogeneity. The extraordinary, we could say that's the weekend, some people would disagree, is marked out from the ordinary. And the week-weekend split exemplifies this. I'm asking the question, without weekends, is the heterogeneity of our social world being lost? And some of the research which I've done with people who work at the weekend and have days off in the week find that that difference is lost to them, that having 2 days off in the week is not the same as having 2 days off at the weekend. The rearrangement of time in Russia and France, where people lost the synchrony with family and friends. And again, that desynchrony is a feature of people's lives who have to work at weekends. They can't make time to meet up with family and friends. And again, I'm asking a question about that. What effect will that have on, for instance, social solidarity? And I'm asking the question, are new forms of capitalism, the market rather than the state, rearranging temporalities and producing different forms of desynchrony? Gary Cross suggests that the weekend is a central construct of industrial society, and that part of the struggle for industrialisation is the demand for space and time free from the market. Are we getting that space and time free from the market now, is what I'm asking. I think that the emergence of the weekend as a time, as a central construct, can be considered as significant as the development of the railways. And the emergence of popular cultural forms, it can be argued, has been partly dependent on the time of the weekend. Although the railway altered the experience of time and space, we might argue that the time of the weekend altered the ways, for instance, in which the railways were used, orientating them towards leisure as well as work. The inauguration of the weekend, that's why I'm so interested in the history of it, certainly in the UK, was not a given. It was inaugurated against a background of labour unrest and political consciousness raising. However, those that had power, the new bourgeoisie, formed a committee in Manchester, and these committees were set up throughout the UK, the Committee for the Establishment of the Saturday Half Holiday, to ensure that their fellow capitalists closed on Saturday afternoon. Now there's many reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into those now, but it's just a very interesting phenomenon that bourgeois capitalists would get together and suggest that Saturday afternoons would be free. There's reasons for that, one of them being that it's a space for consumption. It was one space when people could buy things. What has followed from that first Saturday afternoon off in 1843 is the extraordinary phenomenon of the weekend, a contradictory time space. On the one level, it's provided a time and space for the consumption of non-essential goods and services. On the other, it's been understood as a time and a space of leisure by actors, but one that's gendered, raced and classed. I would go further perhaps, it's a little utopia at the end of the week. This feeling of utopianism is recuperated by commerce and is often signified as such in the publicity for weekend events. However, particularly in club cultures, like rave culture, but also in allotment culture, the culture in the UK of people going to their gardens at the weekend, new social relations are produced, gift economies, cooperation and solidarity, sometimes within a ritualised and sacred space. The new domain of leisure was created through the institutionalisation of free time in the Saturday half holiday. In the second half of the 20th century, scholars of leisure anticipated a leisure society, one where leisure was considered as important as work. And it was imagined that things would always get better and the utopia of a leisure society would eventually come our way, and it hasn't happened that way. One of the examples of this that I want to, not of that necessarily, but of a particular type of economy is epitomised in the film Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. Don't know whether any of you have come across that film. It's a British film directed by Carol Rice, which is about a worker in a factory in Nottingham, and the contrast between the week and the weekend is shown quite conclusively in this film. I'm out for a good time, all the rest is propaganda, and the weekend was kind of the time to have a good time, obviously. This is the poster for the film. It epitomises work and leisure as boundaried domains. Work as prison, the weekend as freedom, and is symptomatic of a Fordist economy dominated by male manual labour. Rojek argues that such domains are today much more fragmented through the processes of globalisation and mediated through flexibilisation. Whilst in the film the factory represented work in the 1960s, the supermarket might well do so today. As such, the work week and weekend would look very different, and thus would leisure. And I suppose what I'm asking partly is, can we still subscribe to the concept of leisure? Cederstrom and Fleming have suggested that the economic and cultural regime epitomised in Fordism left weekends alone. Social time was contractually enshrined in the idea of extra payment for unsocial hours. For supermarket workers and many or most other workers, these payments have ended or reduced. Saturdays and Sundays have become just another work day. As flexible accumulation and globalisation has accelerated, labour markets have relied to a greater extent on the greater flexibility of the worker. This flexibility often produces everyday lives that are desynchronous. This desynchrony is especially acute at the weekend, where it's produced through the uneven breakdown of the 5+2 weekend cycle. Some people get weekends off, some don't. Castells has talked about the conflictive differentiation of time, that is, the way in which network time and its demands conflicts with the times of everyday life. Boundaries between work and leisure are blurred for many, if not most, workers. Temporal reorganisation associated with globalisation, deregulation and flexibilisation has meant the erosion of the weekend as time off. As Rojek has suggested, the idea of the leisure society is thus dead. However, the weekend is not yet dead, yet. I'm asking a question, and it feels like it in the UK at the moment, about whether we live in a period of total work. And that's different, perhaps, to what Jean said earlier. One where any time working is becoming the norm, and workers are contracted to work whenever required. Flexi-time, for instance, now means something completely different than in the 1970s and 80s. Barbara Adams sums it up neatly. Flexibility for the worker gave way to flexibility of the workers. Many of our social lives are organised around the weekend, as may be those of our significant others. But what happens to the little utopia at the end of the week, if it ever was that, if we're working? How can we synchronise our lives with those whom we love? The answer is with difficulty. The weekend, particularly for those with least resources and capitals, is being eroded with nothing similar offered as a substitute. Is this a problem? I think it is. Why? Because having scattered days off in the week is not the same as having weekends off, for many reasons. If you look at the temporal organisation of the weekend, it gives people 2 nights off. 2 nights off from thinking about the work. From thinking about paid work. I know if you work in the home, if you're a woman, it may well be that the weekend is not the best time for you. There is no choice about doing paid work at the supermarket at the weekend, no extra money for working unsocial hours, and so can be, I think, a form of social exclusion. The loss of weekends is really significant, and I feel we need to defend it or think about alternatives, which mean that people have collective time off. And Rojek thinks that we should reconceptualise leisure given economic organisation. But perhaps using Nowotny's idea of proper time, which she calls self-time from the perspective of the individual, it might be a useful adjunct to that of the term leisure. And we need to reassert time for ourselves. Should weekends be a subject for political debate? Do we need to politicise leisure and proper time and link it to demands for a reduction in working hours? How much time have we got, Michelle? The empirical material quoted further on in this presentation arose from interviews with supermarket workers in Manchester and Salford before the present crisis became apparent. However, their rapidly changing contractual arrangements moved towards what I call anytime working and could have been seen as a symptom of the coming crisis. In the UK, we now have possibly 1 million workers on 0 hours contracts, where a contract is offered but with no guaranteed hours for workers. The UK coalition government has to institute a system of workfare or forced labour if in receipt of benefits. This development has implications for weekends. Workfare will involve flexible labour, as will 0 hours contracts. More weekends will be lost. Remuneration for unsocial hours was a payment made for working, for example, at the weekend, a practice that is now not a common one. This extra amount acknowledged that working at particular times is detrimental to social lives. By implication, this suggests that the time for work in the labour market is any time, the proper time of individuals being of no consequence. And again suggests that the individual or even collective production of time and space is becoming ever more unequally classed, raced, gendered and aged. David Harvey refers to this emergent new economy in terms of flexible accumulation, which rests on flexibility with respect to labour processes, labour markets, etc. You can see the numbers in the UK of men and women working in the service sector. Again, much of that is flexible working. There's therefore an invisible class who service, for instance, the city at the weekend. They have little proper time with no weekends and work with no extra pay. And compared with the glitz of the city, they're hidden, paid very low wages, but keep the city working. Their labour never really acknowledged. And again, Adam points out that we have to realise that all working time is not the same, and that used to be acknowledged in different amounts of money paid for working different times. The time of the weekend, far from being understood by employers as unsocial and remunerated accordingly, is now in much of the service sector recast as fair working time. And what I'm going to do in the last slides are provide some excerpts from interviews with some supermarket workers. What's striking about their testimony is their attachment to the weekend and their disappointment at curtailed social lives and desynchrony in relationships. The supermarket, I think, is an under-researched entity, either as a workplace or as a place of shopping culture. It's a useful location to undertake work on the weekend, since it's part of the service industry and is in the forefront of 24-hour flexible working. I interviewed all workers for between 1 and 2 hours, and the interviews focused on biographies and weekends in the context of those life stories. All workers had much to say about weekends. All but 2 felt weekends to be significant for them, which they were uneasy about losing. Of the 2 people that had every weekend off, one felt guilt and joy, and the other just joy. Firstly, though, there is a lovely quote from Kath, and it's about the difference of days. And she just talks about every day and how she likens it to being in a lift. So Wednesday morning's the worst day of the week, and she kind of goes up in the lift until she gets to Friday. Monday's not too bad, but then back down again to Wednesday. So she says many times that she hates Wednesday, and that goes back to Zerubbabel's heterogeneity of days. There was a point at which she felt the week got better. So again, it's a very long quote, so that's the second bit of it. This was perhaps a poignant interview with Jasmine, originally from the Middle East, had no choice about working weekends, had 3 children, one of whom was quite young when I interviewed her. She was offered 18 hours a week at the supermarket, and she had to live on that money earned from 18 hours a week, and occasionally was offered extra hours at the weekend. And she closed her eyes when she said this to me and said, I have to work. I close my eyes and say, okay, I leave my family. And it was quite a difficult thing for her to do, but she did go and work when she had to, but she didn't know when it was going to be. They would say a couple of days before, would you work at the weekend? And Mark talked about Fridays, and you could really feel that he was isolated or kind of left out of Fridays. He worked until midnight at the supermarket, and then suddenly as he got out and into his car and rode through the city, he suddenly remembered it was Friday because he saw everybody having a Friday night. Sometimes when I drive back from work to home, inside I don't feel like it's Friday, but when I come out I realise, yeah, today's Friday, because the streets are busy, packed with people. And Joyce says that she works, I think, most weekends, and if she goes out on a Friday, she says, well, I'm working tomorrow. She can't stay late, can't have a drink with people because she's watching the clock and thinking about the following morning. Emma was someone who was lucky. She'd been given a crap job in exchange for weekends off. She says to have a weekend off is a big deal. I've not had any routine for a long time, so she worked weekends. She worked as a kind of flexible worker for a long time. She said, she talks about time. It's always been scattered. I've always been doing something, and something's encroached on some day, something that I've had to do, and I've never had like 2 days off together, a period of time when there's a period I could separate work from leisure time. It was always interspersed between the different bits. Everything was scattered about. And she talks about what it's like to have weekends off. I don't have to get up for work in the morning so I can do whatever I want. I can go out till whatever hour and do whatever I want. It's not going to impact on anything or anybody else the next day. And finally, my concluding remarks. You can see from what the people I interviewed think about the weekend. It's very important for many of them, either to be with their family, but just when their days off are scattered, time becomes difficult to deal with. The weekend was produced through the rearrangement of time and spaces experienced in the industrialising process. During the 20th century, it became embedded as an acknowledged social time at the end of the week, though access to it was gendered. It's a contradictory time and space, used as a space of accumulation by capital and as a semi-autonomous proper time by social actors. Since the speeding up of the globalising process, attendant flexibilisation and consequent 24/7 working, the weekend has become disembedded and lies in an ambiguous position between different economies, if you like, between Fordism and post-Fordism, between regulation and deregulation. For the precarious worker in the service industries, the weekend is disappearing or non-existent. For others, as the Hassan quote at the beginning suggests, the weekend encroaches more quietly. What should we do? Even though Rojek considers that emotional labour is now a feature of so-called free time and that the idea of leisure as freedom is redundant, the people of the supermarket with whom I talked sounded a lament for their weekends. I'm going to finish there. They sounded a lament for their weekends, and I'm just asking, does that matter? Should we pay attention to that? Does it matter that the weekend might be disappearing? Thank you.